I am Ryan O'Dowd, and this is the Black Hand Communique. Today's episode is going to be called "Kopsick on Co-ops Part Deux, Kopsicker," and it is the conclusion of last week's episode, where we touched on a brief overview of what cooperatives are and how they fit into a revolutionary program. As was last week, today's guest is Joe Kopsick. Say hello, Joe.
Co-Opsick.
All right. And we pretty much covered our summary bases last time, so I'm going to let Joe get straight in to what the 7 cooperative principles are. Joe, what are the 7 cooperative principles?
The 7 cooperative principles, which were established by the International Cooperative Alliance in 1995, are first, voluntary and open membership; second, democratic member control; then member economic participation; autonomy and independence; education, training, and information; cooperation among cooperatives; and concern for the community.
All right, now that all sounds very good and uplifting. Can you get a little more into detail about what that language means? Some of it's a little bit technical sounding. Can you break down each one for me?
Sure, I'll do that. I just want to get to a few notes on cooperatives just to give viewers a little bit more information.
Okay, that's great. I guess here's Joe giving a few notes on cooperatives first.
So just to recap something you asked in the last video, you asked whether cooperatives are on the rise. I said the credit unions or financial cooperatives are on the rise in Britain. And I looked online, I found out that today 100 million people, which is almost a third of the population, are members of credit unions. Also in the US, cooperatives are on the rise in the field of solar energy and taxi cab companies. And by the way, just a note, Uber is not a cooperative, but some people have published articles on the internet saying that it should be, and that we need a cooperative taxi alternative. Elsewhere in the world.
Sorry, just a second. When you say a third of, I think you said a third of people use a credit union, you mean everywhere, or is that just in England, just in the UK?
That's just in the US, 100 million out of 300 million people.
Oh, I had no idea it was actually that high. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Surprised me too.
Keep going.
And there are probably something like 1 billion or 2 billion people in the world who are members of cooperatives in general. And elsewhere in the world, Cuba is turning to cooperatives to solve problems associated with the state-run economy. And sectors in which cooperatives are growing include social care in Quebec and housing in Ecuador. 7 out of the 10 biggest cooperatives in the world by revenue are in Europe, 4 of which are in France. And most of the 10 biggest cooperatives by revenue are banking organizations and credit unions, while others are involved in retail and distribution and agriculture and forestry. And one last fact, there are about 30,000 cooperatives in the US, although only 1% of those 300 are worker-owned and democratic. Those worker-owned cooperatives employ a total of about 3,500 people, generating $400 million in annual revenue, and American cooperatives in general contribute over $150 billion to the nation's total income, which is 1% of the gross domestic product.
Wow, that's actually much bigger than I thought that it was. That's good. Now you said there's about I think it's 350 actual like worker-owned cooperatives. And are they now? They're not being subsidized or anything. They're actually operating in the private economy, right?
Yeah, I think so. No subsidies that I know of. I mean, I think some of them might be getting funds under like the Small Business Administration. I'm not really sure.
But the same funds any other small business would, even if it wasn't a cooperative, probably.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Which you're still, just to reiterate, you are still against that in principle as a libertarian, right?
Yeah, I'm against public funding of businesses, taxpayer funding. Although, I mean, that's because I would want to overall, because I'm a Georgist, kind of geo-libertarian, I like to overhaul the whole tax system, and any tax subsidies that I would want to exist would be funded through taxes on pollution and the hoarding of land. But I still probably wouldn't want it to go to that. I just basically want to have taxes concerning the environment.
Oh, okay. You know, we'll get into that on another episode because that's a whole nother, we could talk about that for a long time. But Now, getting back to the original point, do you think that you can now expand those 7 principles a little bit to give me kind of a summary of what each of those bullet points means?
So I'll start with the first principle, which is voluntary and open membership, and that means that membership in and customer patronage of cooperatives is open and voluntary, meaning that the cooperative is not allowed to exclude or reject anyone, and especially not allowed to discriminate against anyone on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, etc. And membership being voluntary, this means that cooperatives, most importantly, are not allowed to conscript people to become members or customers. And this may sound unusual, but I mention this because although most people don't typically think of themselves as slaves of corporations, although some people do, and especially not as slaves of small businesses, we are required to support businesses, as I mentioned in the last video, because we're required to pay taxes to the government, half of which come from our income. And those taxes often go to subsidize businesses, bail them out, stuff the coffers of politicians and lobbyists who are in the pockets of big business and lobby for tax credits for businesses instead of having those businesses survive on their own. And lobby for regulations that make it harder for new and small businesses to begin to compete against them.
Yeah, I'd like to take a quick aside here to talk directly to people who are maybe listening. You know, take all of this with an open mind and with a grain of salt. Don't write any of this off. Some things that Joe says are probably going to sound like radically leftist, almost like communist, and some of the things he's going to say are going to sound radically right wing, like. And that's because he worked in his free time on a synthetic philosophy and politics to really try to unite the different divergent radical ways of thinking. And so I would encourage everyone to kind of put aside their prejudices at the beginning of this and really give him an open mind, because you'll see he's not easy to peg down, and there's your assumptions about what the limits of political choice are. Joe does not find himself confined by the same way that most people do. So if you could just continue on with more of the points of the 7 points of cooperative principles, that'd be great.
Sure, and just to address what you said real quick, I find myself slightly to the left of libertarians and slightly to the right of the Green Party. I've voted libertarian and supported Ron Paul and Gary Johnson in the past. But and something I'll talk about in a few minutes is a time where I worked for a kind of Green Party associated group. So yeah, I do have I see myself as kind of economic centrist, but politically decentralist and approaching radicalism and anarchism. So the second principle is democratic member control, and that means that board members of the cooperative are elected by its members, which includes workers and includes customers in the case of consumer cooperatives. And you asked in the last video whether cooperatives function as representative democracies where the workers hire their own management, or whether they function as direct democracies where all employees are canvassed to make decisions. I said that both forms of democracy are found in cooperatives, and just to clarify that, there are elected managers in cooperatives, so in that respect they function as representative democracy. But according to Occupy.com, cooperatives enable direct democracy. Continuing, worker cooperatives involve everyone in decision making on a one vote, one share per member basis. So on the one hand, you have one man, one vote, people-centered direct democracy system. And on the other hand, you have elected leadership, which presumably helps put people with managerial skill and expertise into positions of trust so they can guide the cooperative. And if you do this in a very focused way, cooperative provides for most or all of the needs of members, then the cooperative starts to resemble a workers' council or a government more than it resembles a small business. And when you start talking about workers' councils, you're getting into communism and the Soviet system, which, by the way, Soviet means council. And that is a federation of workers' councils that provide for the needs of workers, such as education, training, and information, which is the 5th cooperative principle, which we'll get to in a few minutes. So to recap, the board members of cooperatives are elected by the members themselves, which is a benefit of cooperatives compared to the way that corporations are run. Because in cooperatives, each member has one share and one vote. Whereas in a corporation, different people have different numbers of shares based, of course, on how much they can afford and how many shares they choose to buy. Mm. And this characteristic of cooperatives is also preferable to the way that governments are run, where a simple majority of the people who choose to vote elect corporate funded candidates to become members of a political class, get paid more than the average person. And these people, the people who are elected, get to approve the president's appointment to bureaucratic programs and so-called independent organizations, which are often in reality private organizations like the Federal Reserve, or public-private partnerships, which involve contracts between a public sector authority and a private party, which assumes financial, technical, and operational risk in providing a public service.
Okay,
and
let me stop you there for a second.
Right.
It sounds like a lot of your philosophy on cooperatives and their function and what they would be good for, as opposed to the current system we have, is choice, and giving choices to people, but not an artificial market choice based on competing corporations, which are kind of put into place and subsidized by the government, but a real choice between individuals and people who choose to operate in a collectivist way on a bottom-up scale. It's really people power when you get to the bottom of it, is what it sounds like to me. Would you say that that is correct?
Yeah, you want consumers to be well informed and to know who they're buying from, and know how the groups and organizations are buying from, how they're run. So you want people to have a choice between profit-oriented companies and businesses like cooperatives, which reinvest all their profit into the business itself and into the community and into the workers. And that's you could call that a capitalist or a market-based system, which is, you know, fine in theory. And what I'm saying, I'm just trying to distinguish it from what might be considered more of a right-wing, quote unquote, market point of view, or like a Republican, what you might call a point of view, which is really government subsidized business that, while it operates on a corporate kind of level where there are people working together, there's much more of a stratification between the people who make the decisions and the people who work for the companies or consume from the companies. Whereas while your suggestions in cooperatives and the choices between cooperatives and individual businesses is much more small scale, or it's much more controlled by the consumers and the workers themselves, as opposed to a stratified government and corporate led system. Does that sound right to you? Yeah, and Republicans and corporatists want to undermine this worker control, and a lot of them would probably rather not have any cooperatives and just have a totally profit-oriented system. They like to maximize competition and wherever possible deny people the access to information about what they're buying, and they also want to have intellectual property and trade protections, which is contrasted to the real free market viewpoint, which people sometimes conflate and confuse with what the Republicans want. Republicans really some of them want a limited government, but they do want a government that has the ability to manipulate commerce and make sure businesses are protected.
Yeah, and it still plays favorites. What you're suggesting, basically, no one would play favorites except for on an individual basis of choice. I'm just trying to start by separating what you're saying from a Republican, because I don't want people to be listening to you to write you off because they hear words like market and business and things like that, and then automatically not listen to the rest of what you're saying. That there is a big, significant structural difference in what you're suggesting as a market system and what the Republicans call a market system, which is not a market system. It's a system by corporatists and by government officials, basically.
Right. I'd like to have an economic system where there are a lot of cooperatives and also some profit-oriented businesses, but people aren't required to buy from cooperatives or not required to become their members, which are cooperative principles, but they're free to choose from amongst cooperatives, so that cooperatives, well coordinating with each other because of the cooperation among cooperatives, the sixth principle, they can coordinate with each other, but they can also, in a sense, compete against each other, but really compete in a sense of be independent and autonomous instead of compete with the intent of driving them out of business.
Right. That sounds good. And then what would what would the seventh and last cooperative principle be?
The let's see, last cooperative principle is concern for the community. That means that cooperatives work for the sustainable development and improvement of the neighborhoods, towns, and cities in which they're located through policies and programs accepted by their members. And this stands in contrast to the willful and negligent destruction of communities by big business, which often involves the quasi-enslavement of the local population and or the destruction of the environment and the decimation and hoarding of its resources.
Very good. And this is where I can now kind of come at it from the other side. This might sound very left-wing to some more traditional right-wing people. The idea of community service, taking care of the environment, protecting the workers themselves as in a kind of a horizontal community-based way. But I think what I'm hearing from you is that though this is a system that takes care of its workers and takes care of the environment, it contrasts from a traditional state socialist model in that the care is coming from the people, the consumers and the workers themselves organically, as opposed to being imposed on it from above by those same corporations who ultimately, in our system, take advantage of the idea of social care and use it to control and manipulate the system. Would that be correct to you?
Yeah, and this ties into principle number 5, education, training, and information. A cooperative takes care of its members and gives information to the community about the benefits of joining and becoming members of the co-op, and they provide training and they give skills to their members and workers. So they have an interest to keep them well trained and educated, so they can contribute to how the cooperative is run and managed. And the opposite of that is the way that corporations are run, or the way that big businesses run, where they deny workers the ability to learn about, well, first of all, unions in today's system have an incentive not to teach workers any skills, or at least not to give them give workers skills for free or for a low cost, because it enables them to compete better against well-established workers with seniority. But businesses also work with big labor to discourage workers from unionizing. And that's part of the benefits of cooperatives. In a sense, members are already unionized. And just to tie that into communism, so the benefits of having widespread, having widespread cooperation among cooperatives is that you have a decentralized kind of libertarian way of doing it. And instead of having it come from above instead of having power come from a centralized seat of government. And I think in that sense, decentralized or libertarian communism and what small government libertarians want, or free market capitalists, free market libertarians, whatever you want to call it, I think they have something in common, which is that one thing the libertarians will say a lot is they want to privatize everything. And unless they're like big business Republicans, what they really mean by that is they want small businesses and nonprofits and charities to take over the functions that are typically done by government. And so you can have businesses do that in a way that takes care of their members and is profit oriented, and you can have businesses that are not profit oriented. But the problem is that I feel that a lot of libertarians don't often enough emphasize the role of cooperatives as a small business. There's kind of a disconnect between that.
Yeah, I mean, if I can chime, do you have any more? Is that all the points on the 7 cooperative principles? I think you got them all, right?
Yeah, I think I touched on all of them. One is pretty much autonomy and independence is that principle number 4, that cooperatives enter into agreements with other organizations, but only on the condition that the cooperative retains its autonomy and independence. And this is a way to avoid problems associated with corporatism, like takeovers, buyouts, and competition with the intent of driving other competitors out of business and having a company take you over and change your rules.
Mhm.
And another real quick is member economic participation. And this I'm going to tie this into Mondragon, which we discussed last time.
Yeah.
You asked whether, let's see, you asked, let's see, sorry, one sec. Well, anyway, I found out Mondragon avoids the problem of co-ops becoming for-profit by separating ownership, which varies in value, from voting, which is strictly equal. Instead of buying stock, new applicants advance labor to pay the membership fee. So it's a way of keeping the traditional cooperative principle of having the one man, one vote, one share system, but also having outside investment coming in, except the investors don't come to control the way the cooperative is run in the same way that publicly listed corporations do.
Okay, that's very interesting. It's very interesting. Yeah. So, God, you said you were saying something a couple minutes ago that made me want to go off, and now I can't remember what you were saying. It was based upon the principle you said. I think it was number 5. What's the 5th principle again?
5th principle is education, training, and information.
Okay. Yeah, basically, in my opinion, what Joe is getting at here is to create an alternative to the way things are now. Cooperatives are a great idea for people to, in essence, kind of build up their own alternative system potentially from the bottom up. And in theory, you can go into a dual power system, and then even into some kind of, I don't want to call it an overthrow because I'm going to get busted by the NSA, but you can turn things over on a community basis instead of waiting for, I suppose, the government to do your work for you. But at the same time, it's an alternative to the huge big businesses that kind of take advantage of what are called free trade agreements, like the TPP, which is being I don't know if it's still being negotiated or if it's been approved yet. But part of the problem, I'm going to go on a little rant here. Part of the problem with the system that we have now is that the corporate and financial bodies that sort of govern and control the economies of the world, especially the Western world, are basically internationalized at this point. They can go at will from country to country, export their financial problems. They could have taxes in one country so they don't pay taxes there, while exploiting labor in another country, while selling in a third market, so in a monopolistic way, destroying local businesses. And it's really against any kind of principle of free or fair markets. And at the same time, it's destructive to the environment, and it's destructive to workers' rights and the right of the community to serve its needs first, and the right of the individual even to serve his or her needs first. The problems that are kind of arising in the international scene are familiar, and they've been going on for hundreds of years. The problem has been accelerating, but it's funny because we know in the radical community that the old models of state socialism, they're not going to work. They're not a viable alternative. International communism in the form of that Castro or Mao or Che Guevara upheld is not going to work. Those systems atrophy and they fall apart, but also American style corporate imperialism isn't working either. We see that the Fed gets involved every time that they can to kind of wet the beaks of the financial class, but they also have to get involved just to make the system continue, because a system fundamentally built on error and lie, which is what the system is built upon, is paper and guns and lies that are enforced by violence, is going to inevitably collapse, whether we have anything to put in its place or not. You cannot have a system that's 92%, I believe is what it is. I'm off by a couple percent probably, but 92% of quote unquote assets in the financial and system are paper. You can't have 92% fucking paper assets and expect that the economy is going to continue to grow realistically. It's a false growth, and it's false growth based on lies, enforced by violence. And the thing is, everything is inverted to the way that what you might call morality or reason would have set it up as, because there's anarchy for the powerful and tyranny for the weak right now, because the powerful can go anywhere that they want in the world. They could export their violence, they could export their monopolization, they could control one market while fucking with another people somewhere else. They could destroy the environment of, just throwing out a name, of Chile by growing their crops in a certain way and then selling the United States in a different market. But the rest of us that are actually held to the boundaries of civil law have to obey whatever countries we live in, or else get thrown in prison. We won't be able to be employed. So it's like the powerful are already living in quote unquote anarchy, where the rest of us are kind of held to whatever values they're trying to impose on us. And then the powerful socialize their losses, which is what happened in 2008, 2009. They privatized their gains. So they're extracting our labor, whether we live in the United States here, whether the people of Greece who are currently being utterly crippled by the international financial system, whether you're a worker in China with a fucking net around your skyscraper so that you don't kill yourself. If you jump off, they'll just put you right back at the sewing machine again. It doesn't really matter, because the losses get sucked out of you either in the form of low wages, in the form of unfair distribution of income taxes, because the richest people know how to get around all the tax loopholes and everything. And so you have socialism for the rich, anarchy for the rich, and fascism for the poor, and tyranny for the poor. And what Joe is saying, and I defend him on this, is that we can create an alternative system. A horizontally based, voluntary, but communistic in many ways system. And when I say communist, I don't mean the individual gets sublimated to the collective and we don't exist and we don't have opinions anymore or anything like that. I just mean that we hold a few things in common in order to protect one another. And that maybe that this, what you might call libertarian socialist or left libertarian model, would be an alternative to what we know now is failing, which is the state capitalist imperialist system. And it's also an alternative to the old state socialism, which atrophied, and we just know it's just not going to work anymore. It's not an alternative. So whether it's in Greece, where I have a whole lot of stuff to say about Greece, but I'm not going, or whether it's here, cooperatives are a potential alternative principle for a revolutionary program that maybe are a little easier to get behind for the average person than, you know, strapping an AK-47 to your back and going into the jungle or something like that. I guess that's the end of my rant. How's that sound, Joe?
That sounds good. And a lot of that was about, and you mentioned it once, dual power. And I think dual power based on a system of cooperatives cooperating with each other is a good system, because in a situation where you were talking about international corporations, one thing they can do now is they can sue local and state governments for passing regulation that makes it harder for them to reap profits, even if the point of that law is that, you know, they're destroying the environment and exploiting workers. Right. So now with corporations and their lobbyists essentially buying up small government, or buying up any level of government, the people have no recourse except to depend on businesses, which all too often, even if they're small or cooperatives, are still in the hand of big business and big government. So we have to, if with no other recourse, we have to form, cooperatives that are independent of government, so that people can rely on their workplaces to give them what they need, like principle number 5, education, training, and information.
Yeah, I'm right with you. And another thing that I think is important to remember about all this is not being said as a dogmatic one-way approach. This is a suggestion that involves a coalition of multiple approaches working together, basically against the international state capitalist financial model that we have right now, where it's okay to attack the monster from multiple angles in multiple different ways, as long as we're chipping away at it from either our angle. We have much more in common with one another as members of the radical community than we have against one another in principle, I think.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that that there was some, I believe it was called Lending Tree, that worked with the Chamber of Commerce, with cooperatives and business alliances. Can you tell me about that, Joe?
Yeah, in Madison, Wisconsin, in 2012, I worked for the whole name of the organization. It's Liberty Tree for short, but the whole name is Liberty Tree Foundation for the Democratic Revolution. It's managed by Ben Mansky and his wife, Sarah. It used to be based in Madison. I'm not sure where it's based now. I know the Manskys moved to, I think it's California. But Ben Mansky was Jill Stein's campaign manager for 2012 Green Party presidential run. So most of my employees were Green Party members. And I worked for what was called the Wisconsin Wave of Liberty Tree's efforts. I was walking door to door, asking for donations, dropping leaflets, and letting residents know about Liberty Tree's efforts. And the goal of Liberty Tree was to encourage local businesses to withdraw their support from WMC, which is Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, which is the state's most influential business lobbying group.
Yeah.
In 1975, it was actually formed out of the state Chamber of Commerce and also the State Council of Safety and the Wisconsin Manufacturers Association. So it's an association of manufacturers, service businesses, and chambers of commerce. And what we were involved in is doing what's called a divestiture campaign. Divest is the opposite of invest. Mm-hmm. So we were raising awareness of an effort to encourage businesses to withdraw their support of WMC. And you mentioned withdrawing support of big business in the last video. So we wanted businesses to stop being members of WMC and instead invest in alternative business alliances. And one of the business alliances that we were floating, that we were trying to get as something for these businesses to become partners with, was AMIBA, AMIBA, the American Independent Business Alliance. And in my opinion, and this is what it has to do with cooperatives, if we could get the National Cooperative Business Alliance or any business alliance for cooperatives, then we'd be able to better achieve, more quickly and efficiently achieve that principle number 6, cooperation among cooperatives.
And that's really the next level. Is when the cooperative movement can become a sort of political movement in of itself. It sounds to me like it's doing a good job of uniting what you might call the left and the radical right or alternative right up there in Wisconsin, which is just great. I approve of that wholeheartedly. The next step really would be, it almost reminds me of the IWW, only it doesn't have to be so worker oriented. The idea of a union of unions or something like that, a cooperative of cooperatives that are voluntary, just for the idea, because that's going to give you parity and leverage in the marketplace, which is from a libertarian, with a little L libertarian perspective, really parity and purchasing power and leverage in the marketplace almost is politics, as opposed to the traditional way of thinking of politics as voting in parties and things like that. But just the organization of people uniting to self-govern in a specific way is the alternative political system, you might say.
And you mentioned purchasing power. Another thing I haven't mentioned is purchasing cooperatives. And as opposed to the current, government corporate system where they take our taxes and give it to a political class as a way to ostensibly save money for the people so they can buy essential services, sometimes from private businesses in the case of public-private partnerships. Instead, if you have networks of purchasing cooperatives, and which is related to Ricardian socialism and distributism, if you have a place where people can pool their money and cooperate to buy services and goods for lower prices, then you avoid all the problem associated with coerced taxation and government investing in and partnering with and profit-oriented companies to provide services the government should be providing.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds good. And not to get too much on what I'm all about, but I have a few ideas about alternatives that have to do with what you were just talking about. Like, I think it would be great to organize an energy bank, essentially using distributivism. I'm a fan of distributive models. I'm not a communist. I don't think we should own all property together or anything like that. But I'm not comfortable saying that. Personally, I'm not comfortable saying private property should be unlimited and without any kind of way for the community to push back against things that are happening, in terms of pollution or something like that. But I really like distributivist models, at least as a transition from what we have now to something else. But what I was saying is I have the idea for an energy bank, so that in essence it would be like any other bank, only instead of money it's in electricity, and you say you'd put solar panels on your house, and then using, this is of course theoretical at this point, but if you have some kind of automated mechanism to create another solar panel, you, as part of the agreement, you would use your energy from your solar panels to build more solar panels, and then instead of paying back to a bank, you pay forward. So you then use those solar panels to give to you have to give them to the next person, who then has to give them to the next person, et cetera, et cetera. So instead of an interest system that pays back to a holder of an account, it's an interest system where the agreement is you pay forward interest to more and more people. And I like that idea for energy use. And I think that works in terms of seeds and farming too, because of course the investment you turn on a tomato is heavier than, if you think about it in numbers, is heavier than any number you're going to turn with money. And if you get one tomato, it's got 100 seeds in it if you know how to take care of it. That's 1,000%, 100% profit. So if you then again you have a pay forward bank instead of a pay backwards bank. So instead of saying I'm going to give you a tomato and you owe me 10 tomatoes back, you say I'm going to give you a tomato and you owe 10 tomatoes to 10 other people. Mm-hmm. And that's how the agreement would work. I think that it wouldn't work in all aspects of the economy, but I think in food production and energy, it would work as a model pretty well. That was something I was thinking about.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And I think that in today's system with the government, there's a little too much emphasis on pay it back rather than pay it forward. I could talk about benefits we give to seniors as opposed to that we give to young people. But I think seniors kind of I know this isn't exactly related to energy or farming or anything, but
cool. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think seniors, they paid into Social Security, and I think they deserve that back. But what young people need, I think I think a lot of baby boomers kind of think that our generation are so have so much benefit just because we have a lot of access to resources and we have phones in our pockets, but really we have so much less economic opportunity and social freedom compared to what people had 30 years ago. So I think we need to focus on paying it forward rather than paying it back. And a way to do that is to remove all the protections, or remove some of, or if you're an anarchist, remove the protections that seniors and workers and workers with seniority have, and give skills and education to new workers and young people so they can contribute to society.
Yeah, and the thing is, not to get all hippy dippy or philosophical about this, but nature is a growth model in and of itself, and you don't. I think that a lot of this pay it back form of interest that is in the world is acting from a position of insecurity or artificial scarcity that isn't really there. I mean, especially when it comes to food, like I said, agriculture pays itself forward almost automatically. It's the lack of access and the control of the resource and the monopolization of the resource of land and using it for agriculture that makes it scarce, not the agriculture itself, which naturally, that's what it does. It expands and it expands and it expands. Mm-hmm. And again, energy, on a renewable system, energy would work the same way, because it's, anything photosynthetic, anything coming from the sun is going to work this way, basically. And I don't think the older generation, it's funny to talk about that, but I don't think the older generation gets that idea, even this notion that you can build wealth more by paying it forward than by holding on to it a lot of the time. I don't think they see it. And they have a tendency to look at either the American private property, slow growth savings and imperialism way, or the state socialist way. And I don't think they see it the same way we do in terms of gaining access to markets for all, that if you share something voluntarily, that's a 100% gain for both of you instead of a loss for either one of you, and things like that. So I think that's all in a tangential way. That's all related to cooperatives, which is what we're supposed to be talking about today.
Right. And I'll get back to that in one sec. I just so yeah, I think too many seniors, for lack of a better word, too many on the left, Bernie Sanders excluded, though. I think too many people are, and some people on the right too, in general. I mean, the working class. Too many people view the set of resources available in the country. They want to get their piece of the pie. They kind of tend to think that resources are fixed rather than growing, like what you mentioned about farming.
Yeah.
So yeah, we, like, as I think Bernie Sanders said recently, people need to have a share of their pie, but we need to remember that the pie is growing, so we can invest and get a greater share back instead of just saving it up. And so, if you don't mind, I'm just going to get back to what we were saying about cooperatives. And you said you're trying to avoid the term overthrowing, but I'm going to talk about general strikes.
Oh, that's right. I love general strikes. Go for it.
So the goal of this cooperation among cooperatives, principle number 6, and also of Liberty Tree, is that greater and more focused, more efficient cooperation among cooperatives is a way to more easily organize effective boycotts. And this would make it easier to organize a general strike, which involves an entire community in a strike, and would help make the voices of workers and people in general be heard in an environment where big business owns and dominates the government and the electoral process. So yeah, as I said, it's difficult to organize a boycott because our taxes still go to bail out and subsidize businesses. Mm-hmm. And so if more businesses were unionized and or run on the cooperative model, then maybe they'd be more likely to have signs on their windows and things like union labels, or in this case cooperative labels, so that people can more easily and more quickly tell whether what they're buying is provided by a business that runs on a more egalitarian model. And,
yeah.
And the goal of this is to have a general strike so that to give power back to workers in a corporate-dominated government and economy.
That sounds great to me, man. That's the kind of shit that gets you invigorated. Actually, I was thinking about it this last week. I've been thinking about a general strike, and America isn't too familiar with that concept, but in Europe they have more of a history of doing that every so often, especially in places like France. They love throwing general strikes, which is pretty cool in my opinion, as far as a political culture is concerned. But I couldn't believe, man, that the Greek people didn't throw a general strike. I was thinking about that last week. Like when they did the referendum and rejected austerity, and then Tsipras kicked out Varoufakis and just sold out the left and just forced austerity down the people's throat. I was like, man, isn't it so European to just throw a general strike if something like that happens? Like I couldn't believe that they just took it. Like it doesn't seem like that's what Europe's all about. It's like even the very diverse revolutionary history of Europe, they seem to have forgotten where power really comes from, ultimately politically, which is the consent of each individual. And that's the power of the general strike, is to organize the disempowered to simply refuse to fucking cooperate because the terms just suck. You know what I'm saying? Like at a certain point, if like a referendum is as close to our system's ever going to get to real democracy, unless there is a revolution or a cooperative of cooperatives at some point. A referendum's as close as our system allows us, basically, without us taking the power ourselves. So the fact that they said overwhelmingly, we don't want austerity, and then Tsipras just said, fuck you, I'm just going to do it anyway, even though he ostensibly was elected against it. I could not believe they did not throw a general strike at that point, because that seems like the European thing to do to me. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. As for America, I think even if we wanted to have a general strike, I think it would be really difficult, aside from working for what Liberty Tree wants. One thing I've talked about a lot is labor policy, and I did a lot of research when Scott Walker was doing the Act 10 to limit the rights of public sector workers to negotiate. And one thing I found out, I actually came to support right to work laws, or really just getting rid of all labor laws in general, because I found out that in order to have a strike, you have to request the permission of a bureau in the federal government. Let's see, can't even remember the name of it right now.
Is it the Department of Labor?
It's part of the Department of Labor.
See, that's how it works. Like the people have such an unbridled power. There's so much potential. I mean, all these things that are being built all the time, all this commerce that's being done, is, if you think about it, the people doing it. Although it's being filtered and controlled by corporate CEOs, politicians, and things like this. It sucks, because things that are supposed to be good in theory when they come into power, like Department of Labor or something like that, they really end up being just another control to redirect the people against what their best interests are. Like, it's supposed to be, in theory, advocacy within the government itself on behalf of the labor of the United States. But what it ends up being is a forced mediation acting on behalf, quote unquote, of the people, that therefore the people can't demand their own rights.
And the part of the Department of Labor I just remembered is the National Labor Relations Board, and that was started under FDR. So not only do you have to get permission from this government bureau, you have to get the permission of the union leaders, and also, if it's a public sector union, the politicians and the taxpayers. And you also have to get at least 50% of the members of the union to agree on it. And there is an effort underway led by Mark Bocan, who I actually ran against. He's the U.S. House of Representatives member from Madison, Wisconsin. He's looking to pass a law overturning this 80-year-old federal labor law to have a lower threshold than 50%. Just have a small part of a union agree on a set of terms in order to require the government to step in and require the management and ownership to negotiate with that smaller union. But until something like that can happen, or until labor law is overhauled completely, then now the National Labor Relations Board, the government can actually rule against smaller unions and allow bigger unions to sue these smaller unions out of business. And the problem with having this 50% threshold is that you leave more radical unions, potential unions, and less radical unions, you leave them out of the mix. So you just have the 50% that's the most pragmatic, essentially the ones, usually, unfortunately, all too often, the 50% that's most ready to compromise and just give the ownership and management whatever they want, instead of being willing to consider things like strikes.
Yeah, and again, this is the way that the state and capital, they set up this little 3-card Monte game, or the cup game with the ball underneath it, because they end up giving this false dichotomy between either the state's going to operate on behalf of capital against you, or the state's going to take over labor and then control, mitigate, and exploit it to minimize your strikes. Like, it's like an old anarchist, and I don't consider myself personally to be an anarchist, although I'm very much leaning in that direction. an old anarchist, critique that I think is true is every time the state gets involved, they only end up acting on behalf of capital anyway. That they're like even people that are well-intentioned that are on the left need to recognize that the old state socialist huge state edifice model doesn't work. It atrophies because the state ends up acting on behalf of the ruling class anyway. It'll work for a short term if you've got the right charismatic leader. It might work for a little while. You know what I'm saying? But as soon as it institutionalizes itself, you can't institutionalize a revolution, which again is an old anarchist philosophy that the revolution is continual, unlike Marxism, pure Marxism, which says the revolution happens and then history's over and that's it. Anarchists say the revolution is continual. You have to keep fighting it and fighting it and fighting it.
Yeah. And one example of the government getting involved and just screwing everything up and acting in the interests of big business is when, I think it was under Teddy Roosevelt, that the Department of, right now we have two of the executive level branches we have the Department of Labor and the Department of Commerce. Under Teddy Roosevelt, I think it was called the Department of Labor and Commerce, something like that. So it was unified into one before it split up. And I think it was split up so that kind of one, whatever the biblical expression is, one hand let not the left hand know what the other hand's doing. So that over here you'd have the Department of Labor studying employment statistics and looking out for the concerns of workers, supposedly. And over here you have the Department of Commerce, which essentially functions as just a lobbying agency that wants to give trade and intellectual property protections and protect American national interest overseas, which is really just economic interest. And
the economic interest of that same elite group, too. It's not really even everyone's economic interest.
Right.
Yeah, and of course, again, a whole another issue is a lot of times, to go back to your talking about you working in Wisconsin for right to work laws. Again, a lot of leftists at first are going to recoil against just the very thought of what you just said. But if you listen, guys, if you listen to the reason he's saying that he's against them, it does make sense. And put aside your prejudice for a second and assume he's being honest with you, because Joe's got nothing to gain from any of this. He doesn't have he's not invested in Fortune 500 or anything like that. It's the fact that the state ends up co-opting the labor movement, and I think and I thought for some time, even if you're like a communist, the quickest way to communism would be through right-wing libertarianism, in my opinion. If you just deregulate everything, and remove everything, you're going to have a massive social cataclysm that's going to occur if you don't do what me and Joe are suggesting, which is form a cooperative of cooperatives, form a third way community in this way that forms an alternative to the current political system. I think that if you just deregulated the hell out of everything, let businesses and corporations run everything, you're going to end up with a cataclysm anyway. I actually feel like a lot of the time the American left ends up working as the friendly face of the American right, and that it's kind of like mommy, daddy, sort of like we control the money and we make all the decisions. Mommy's gonna tell daddy, be nice to your son, be nice to your daughter, give him things, and daddy's got to be back there, well, we got to do work and he's got to learn to do what he's supposed to do. But really, we don't need, at the core, what me and Joe are saying is we do not need this paternalistic or maternalistic government telling us what to do about things. If we look at each other and help one another as individuals and working collectively voluntarily. And that's not to say that this is some kind of right-wing fantasy where money rules everything, but actually that we start to unite horizontally as opposed to begging mommy for treats or running away from daddy when he comes at us with a stick. That's my point of view on it. We have been having a fantastic conversation, Joe, but we're going on an hour now already. So I'm thinking we should do a third episode about this and let the magic number 3 decide the final and the conclusion about things. Would you be willing to come on again next week?
Yeah, could I just quickly plug my blog?
Oh yeah, I was about to do. We're both going to do a little plug here.
Gotcha.
So go ahead and Joe's got a blog he runs, and anything else you want to plug, go for it, Joe.
All right. Yeah, it's just that. The blog's called The Aquarian Agrarian, AQUARIAN, in case you didn't hear me. It's at www.aquarianagrarian.blogspot.com. It focuses on political issues and radical political theory. And the articles that I've written that focus the most on cooperatives, and you can go Google Aquarian Agrarian plus these terms, or just go to the blog and find the search bar on the top left and type these in. The first is called non-apartism, which is a synthesis anarchism idea that I had, NONAPARTISM. Then Party for Mutualism and Cooperation, another called Privatization and Industrial Combinations, which is just an image, a diagram of how different businesses are run. And the last one is Diagram of the Public, Private, and Third Sectors, which has a little bit of insight into nonprofits, the differences between the economic left and right, and public-private partnerships.
Okay, that sounds excellent, Joe. And one more thing, my friend. Please tell everyone out there that's listening your credentials. You have a degree in political science, isn't that true?
Yeah, I majored in political science. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from UW-Madison. And in 2010, I started heavily blogging and started this blog because, as I mentioned before, Scott Walker with the Act 10, the public sector negotiation bill that limited public sector union negotiation. And in 2012, I ran for the U.S. House of Representatives from Madison, Wisconsin's 2nd District, received 6 votes. And 2 years later, in 2014, I ran in Oregon, but dropped out because the paperwork was just kind of too much for me. But I'm running again in Illinois' 10th District in Lake County, just north of Chicago, against Republican Bob Dole, who's the Dold, not Bob Dole, D-O-L-D, Robert Dold, and presumably Brad Schneider, who's a Democrat. And I'm running under the Absurdist Party, which does not exist. It's just me at this point. But yeah, I'll be trying to get on the ballot, filling out some candidate surveys for various political PACs and parties, and trying to appear on the ballot through getting some petition signatures, probably a few thousand.
Excellent. So we got Joe, who's a poli-sci major and an anarchist, and me, who is an artist and musician. So together we're really making our fathers proud, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
Here's my plug. It's backwards because of the camera, but this is my band, Bitter Ink Initiation. The album just came out on Commodity Fetish Records, release 000001. It's only $3, the magic number 3. Buy it. If you're interested in purchasing it, you can write me a note down there in the YouTube page, and I will email you with the information on how to get it. Also, my band, Bitter Ink, will be putting on a show at the Lincoln Theater at 6 p.m. on November 15th here in Raleigh, North Carolina. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. Joe, it was fantastic having you on, and I cannot wait until we talk again.
Thank you.
I'm Ryan O'Dowd, and this has been the Black Hand Communique saying, fuck the banks.